Hi guys, welcome or welcome back to another day of Bookmas. I feel like this video is going to be one of my favorites both to watch and to film because we're going to be looking at all my favorite and least favorite books that I've read in 2024 up until this point. I went through my book journal and looked at every single book that I've read so far this year, and honestly I was a little afraid that I wouldn't have too many books that stood out as being favorites. I don't know why, but I just feel like I haven't had that many amazing reads this year, but thankfully that was actually not the case. I feel like I read so many good books and I have picked out my 15 top favorites. As for my least favorites, I only have 5 to talk about, which I feel like is pretty good. And for all of these books, I'm not going to be really going super in-depth into what they're about, otherwise we would be here for hours. So I'm going to try my best to keep it short and just give you a brief overview of what each book is about and then why I loved it or didn't. We're of course going to start off with my favorites, and I'm saving my absolute top 5 for the end. I tried my best to rank those 5, but the other 10 are in no particular order. So I'm just going to start with what's on top, which is Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I love TJR. I feel like I have not read a book by her that I didn't absolutely love. Everything I think has been a 4.5 stars or above. And speaking of my ratings, I feel like I have to preface this. I feel like I'm the worst at rating books. I'm so inconsistent and I rarely ever rate a book 5 stars, and I feel like more times than not I look back at a book that I gave 4.5 stars and I'm like, actually I think that's a 5 star. But looking back at the year, I feel like my ratings are just all over the place. I'll look at like 2 or 3 different books and what I initially rated them is so off. Maybe I rated one higher but I actually enjoyed the other one so much more. So I'll tell you my initial star rating for these, but I might have to make some adjustments. Carrie Soto is one that I initially gave 4.5 stars, but looking back at it I would give it a 5. This was kind of an unexpected love for me because it's all about tennis, which I never thought I would find interesting, but I think anybody can read and enjoy this whether you know anything about tennis or nothing. I personally knew nothing and I didn't really care. I still don't really care about tennis, but I loved everything in this book. Carrie Soto was such a tough, rude, unlikable character, but at the same time I loved her. I read this back in February and it still easily stands out as one of my favorites. I don't know if this one or Malibu Rising is my favorite book by her. I think it might be this one, but I'm not totally sure. But this was so good. Even though I only gave it 4.5 in the moment, I would say this was my first 5-star read of the year. Then we have a much more recent read, which is Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. This is the first book in the Magnolia Parks Daisy Hates universe. And this series is so loved, so talked about that I'm sure most people know what this is. But it's basically like a British Gossip Girl where we're just following a bunch of young rich kids and their drama. I read this one and Daisy Hates this year, and I only included this one on the list because I genuinely feel like I loved this one so much more. I went into this kind of skeptical. People either love or hate this series because it's just kind of insufferable characters at some points, but I honestly really liked everybody. I loved the writing. I feel like I said this a million times, but it's just like Jessa Hastings tapped right into my brain and was writing exactly how I think. And it took me a little bit to get into it, but I got so hooked on all the drama going on. I was so invested, and I cannot wait to get to the next book to figure out what's going to happen with Magnolia and BJ. This is one that I'm honestly just relieved that I enjoyed so much because I built it up so much in my head because there's so much hype around it, but I really enjoyed it. And this is one that I did give 5 stars in the moment, and I still stand by that. But I totally understand that this series is not for everybody, but it was for me. Then we have A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J Maas, which honestly, I'm like somewhat surprised that this made the list, but then also not surprised because this is the only book that I've read all year in the ACOTAR series. So I'm only 2 books in, and I read this back in February. Yeah, I read this at the end of February, and I still haven't picked up the 3rd book. So I feel like the ACOTAR series has kind of just been at the back of my mind. I've just been feeling a little intimidated by it, but I genuinely really loved this book. It was a 4.5 star, and I stand by that. I don't think this one was quite a 5 star, but I really enjoyed this so much more than book 1. I really enjoyed the plot so much more in this one, the romance. I feel like this book took me a really long time to get through, but once I got to like the second half of it, I absolutely just devoured it. I was so into it. And this is something else I said a million times, but at the end of this one, I felt like it set up book 3 perfectly to where book 3 could be an all-time favorite of mine. I just haven't picked it up yet, which is all on me, but this one I genuinely really loved. And I feel like I never talk about it. I never really think about it, but when I was going through this list, I was like, I cannot exclude this one because I had such a great time reading it. So I don't know, this one's kind of weird because it's not a standout that I think about, but it was probably one of my favorite reads of the whole year. Then we have The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This is a historical fiction that takes place during World War II in Paris. So it's a very tough read, it's very emotional, and I was very intimidated going into it because 1, it's loved and hyped up so much, and 2, I don't normally really enjoy historical fiction, or at least it's not a genre that I'm drawn to, but I really liked this one. I read it so much quicker than I thought. This is quite a big book. It's probably around as long as A Court of Mist and Fury, and I read this one in half the time. And I have to admit, this one wasn't a 5 5-star. It wasn't like the most spectacular thing I've ever read, which I know it is for a lot of people. Like, this is my mom's favorite book of all time. She raves about it and has been begging me to read it for so long. I didn't quite have that experience with it, but I did really enjoy it. The plot and the story itself was so amazing, and I also think her writing was so good. It was so easy to digest for such a heavy topic, but it also got me really emotionally invested. This book did make me cry just a little bit, which I think is a very difficult feat to achieve. This is so far the only book that I've read by Kristen Hanna, and it got me to really want to pick up more of her books because I think she's a really great writer who deserves all the hype that she gets. Next is another book by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And I know I am like one of the last people on earth to read this book. I can't believe I only read it like a couple months ago. And this was beautiful and stunning, just like everybody says it is. I would say that if I had to rank the 4 books I've read by her, at the top it's probably a tie between Malibu Rising and Carrie Soto, then this one, and then, what's it called? The one about the band? Daisy Jones and the Six. I feel like that should tell you how much I enjoy her writing, because even though this is not my favorite book by her, it still easily belongs in my top 15. I did really enjoy the way that the story was told in this one because we got 2 different points of view, and I really love when we get kind of a story within a story. And same as her other books, I just feel like she writes characters that I connect with so much. Did I say that one's a 4.5? Because it is. Next is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, which is a sci-fi about a man in space, which is definitely not really up my alley. I probably never would have picked up this book if I hadn't heard such amazing things about it. And actually, I don't know if I bought this or if I got it as a gift or as a blind date with a book. I'm not even totally sure that I purchased this myself. However, it ended up in my possession. I am so glad that I read this, and actually, no, I listened to it on audiobook, and I am so glad I did that. This is one book that I highly, highly recommend on audiobook, and I have a lot of y'all to thank for that because so many of you recommended that I listen to it, because this book can get very technical. It's got a lot of science and math in it, and I feel like if I was reading it, I could have gotten lost in that and not really been immersed. But I personally loved the audiobook. I loved the narrator. It was this kind of sassy man, and I just really enjoyed it. And there's also a side character in this who I loved so much. I gave this book 4.5 stars in the moment, but looking back on it, I honestly feel like it's more of a 5. And so much of that I feel like is due to my experience with the audiobook. I could see some people finding the narrator to be so annoying. Just to put that out there, I would maybe listen to a sample of it first because you might hate it. But I personally loved it, and I feel like I need to recommend this book and talk about it way more. I feel like it kind of fell to the background because I read it earlier in the year, but it was so good. Then we have the only true romance, I guess, that ended up on the list, which is Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. I say true romance because Magnolia Parks is also considered a romance, I think, but I wouldn't really go into it saying it's a romance. It's more of like general fiction kind of, but this is just your classic straight up rom-com, and I had such a good time with this one. This is probably my lowest rated book on the whole list because it is a 4-star, and that's because I loved the beginning of this so much. One of the things in this book is the 2 main characters are writing letters to each other, and I love when people do that in books. It just gets me every time, and they did it so well in this one. So I absolutely loved the beginning, and I feel like the second half wasn't quite as strong for me, but I still really enjoyed it, and I feel like it's easily my favorite rom-com that I've read this year. And last, we have the first 3 books in the Red Rising series. This is a sci-fi series that I feel like gets a lot of love, and I personally totally agree with all the hype. I love this series. The first one I read back in January, and I gave this a 4.5 star. I still stand by that because the beginning of this one I feel like was so amazing. The first like 100, 200 pages had me so sucked in. I feel like it was so fast-paced, so much fun. I really enjoyed it. And then the second half of the book kind of dragged on a little bit, which is why I gave it a 4.5 instead of a 5. But the first half of this book was 100% 5-star quality. I loved it, and I feel like it was a good start to the series. Then for books 2 and 3, I can't really give you anything else without spoiling them, but I'll say I really enjoyed Golden Sun, but it didn't quite hit the 5-star mark yet. It was also sitting around a 4.5, but Morning Star is where we really pulled through, and I got a 5-star. I loved this book. It made me cry, it made me laugh, it made me so emotional. I got so invested and attached to these characters, and technically I believe that when he first wrote this, it was originally supposed to be a trilogy, so this was going to be the ending, but since then I think there's like 4 more books in the series, so it's definitely not over, but I feel like this one had that feeling of the culmination that you get in the final book in a series where it really got me, and by that point obviously I was 3 books in, very invested. I just really loved it, but it also tore my heart out at the same time. Okay, moving on to my top 5 books of the year. I feel like honestly, the books that are on this list are very unexpected for me. We have a lot of general fiction going on, which at the beginning of the year I would have told you was my least favorite genre, but I am now learning that I really love general fiction. It's definitely not the genre that pulls me in the most, but I feel like it's the one that's most likely to get me to emotionally connect with the book and just really feel things, good or bad. So surprisingly, 3 out of the 5 books are what I would consider general fiction. But let's just go ahead and start with book number 5, which is The Wedding People by Alison Espach, I think. Again, this is a book that I wasn't really that interested in reading. It was actually a book club pick, so I was forced to read it. And I remember actually when I put it on the TBR for that month, I was like, I honestly really don't want to get to this. It was in the middle of fall and I was like, this book is just not fall at all. It's not the vibes I want. I don't want a general fiction. But oh my god, I'm so glad that I was forced to read this because I loved it. It was so good. And this book was getting a lot of hype. So I think that I probably would have bought it and it probably would have sat on my shelves for quite a while if I wasn't forced to read it. So I am so glad, so thankful that my book club picked this one. I don't want to give too much away about this one, but it's basically about a woman who has always dreamed of going to this fancy hotel. She always wanted to go with her husband and now she is alone and she's going without her husband. She gets there and realizes that she is the only person at the whole hotel who is not there for a wedding, and she ends up making an unexpected connection with the bride. The writing in this was actually so funny. It had me laughing out loud at some points, which rarely ever happens with the book. I feel like she did such a good job of balancing the comedy with the much more heavier topics, which you're probably going to see in this list. That is a very common thing for me. I love when a book has both comedy and lightheartedness and really heavy, sad topics. If an author can balance those two things together, I really enjoy it. And I feel like she did such a good job with this one. I just ate up the whole thing. There's not always a whole lot going on plot-wise, but at no point was I bored. I just really loved it. At the time, I gave it a 4.5, but obviously I'm ranking it here higher than some books that I gave 5-star. So I feel like that means this has to be a 5-star. But like I said, I am just so awful with my ratings. All I know is that this one definitely made it in the top 5. Moving on to book number 4, we have The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. Oh, this book. No book has ever made me cry as much as this one. I literally sobbed for probably 30 minutes at the end of this book. And like I said, I really do not cry from books often. So that is such an amazing feat that this book achieved that. And I am so glad that I emotionally connected with this one so much and just got so into it. This is another book that is talked about so much and I feel like it's kind of love or hate. Some people don't enjoy it because it's a pretty long story and not a whole lot happening plot-wise. So some people find it to be very boring, but then others like myself find it to be a beautiful story with some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read. I actually annotated this book, which I rarely ever do, but it is just full of highlights and underlines because Miss V.E. Schwab knows how to write the most beautiful lyrical sentences. I knew going into it that that's why a lot of people love this book, is because of the pretty writing, but it did not disappoint. In this book, we are following Addie LaRue, who accidentally makes a deal with the devil to live forever, but the catch is that nobody will ever remember her. So she could be speaking to somebody, but as soon as they turn around and lose sight of her, they forget all about her. So she has to totally adapt and she's living quite a lonely existence until like 300 or 400 years later when somebody finally remembers her. I actually put a lot of pressure on this book because before reading it, I kept saying that I wanted this book to be like my favorite book of all time. I honestly don't know why, but this book had a lot to live up to. And I wouldn't say that it's my favorite book in the whole world, but it is one of my favorites. It was so good. It did not disappoint. Honestly, I was debating between books 2 and 3 for quite a while. I feel like this was such a hard choice. So really these two are pretty much neck and neck. But at the current moment, I'm ranking number 3 as The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This is another fantasy and it's about Linus, who is a caseworker for the department in charge of magical youth. And he gets sent to this house that's basically an orphanage for children who have been deemed to be super dangerous because of whatever their magical abilities are. So they are very much outcasts and they are living on this house that's very secluded under the care of Arthur and a couple other people who live on the grounds. From what I remember, I think the department in charge of magical youth is kind of looking to shut down this house. So that's kind of the goal when they send Arthur there, but he ends up falling in love with the children, with Arthur, with the house. Everybody in this house has formed such a strong found family, which is one of my favorite tropes. I just love all of the characters. I love all the kids. This book actually made me laugh. It made me sad. It made me happy. Overall, it was just such a feel-good book, and that's my favorite. A feel-good book is my favorite kind of book. You will notice a theme with the next 2 books. There obviously needs to be some depth, emotion. It can't just be like happy stuff. I feel like the books that end up making me feel the best are the ones that have happy moments, but also a lot of really sad moments. And this was just everything I've ever wanted in a book like that. And I loved that it was also a fantasy and it had all of these magical elements to it. It was so much fun. It's another one that I don't know what the heck I was doing because I think I rated it 4.5 stars in the moment, but this is 100% a 5-star. Obviously, it's in my top 3. It was just so good. And I recommend this to pretty much anybody. I feel like anyone would love this. Even if you don't really like fantasy, it's definitely the easiest fantasy to get into. There's not like world building or anything difficult to get into it. It's more just there's magical elements to it. And I personally just can't fathom somebody not liking the contents of this book. It was just so sweet. Thinking about it is making me so happy. I kind of want to reread it, but actually the second book in this series just came out recently. So I am of course going to read that one. And I'm hoping it does all the same things that this one did. Book 2 is Remarkably Bright Creatures Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. Honestly, I feel almost the exact same about The House on the Cerulean Sea. Like I said, there is a very big theme here between the last 3 books because this book made me happy, it made me sad, it made me laugh. This one also has, I guess what you could maybe call some magical elements to it. I'm not really sure, but I feel like this definitely fits in the general fiction category, but it's about a talking octopus, so it's definitely not very realistic. This is about a woman named Tova who works at an aquarium, and she ends up making a bond with this octopus, and he doesn't actually speak out loud. Her and him don't actually talk to each other. We actually just get a lot of like diary entries from the octopus, which was so fun and unique. I went into this thinking that he was going to be speaking out loud, and I was a little bit hesitant. So I would say if talking octopus puts you off, maybe don't write it off right away, because I feel like it's done in a really good way where we're just getting his thoughts in these diary entries. The octopus, which his name is Marcellus, his diary entries are all along the lines of day 1000 something of my captivity. You're just getting tidbits of everything through his perspective. And he's an octopus, so he is incredibly smart. He escapes from his, what is it called? It's not a cage. Why can't I think of it? What are creatures in an aquarium and tank? He escapes from his tank periodically, and Tova is finding him in all these weird places, but Tova also has a lot going on in her own life. Her son actually went missing, I think like 25 years ago. He went on a boat and never came back, so she is still very much dealing with the grief of that, and we are just following her story along with a bunch of other side characters. And then Marcellus kind of ties it all together. I feel like maybe the best way to describe books like this is that they give me like butterflies almost. I really don't know how to describe it. I've always kind of just called it the 5-star feeling, and I feel like this one is a perfect example of that. I mean, I almost was like feeling giddy while reading this book. I know a lot of people get that kind of feeling when they're reading a romance book, but these are the kind of books that do that for me instead. And again, I never thought that I would enjoy general fiction this much. And this one isn't strictly general fiction, I guess, because we have a talking octopus, but I feel like I'm rambling and I could talk about this book for a really long time, but I just highly recommend this to literally anybody. My friend Chloe is one of the pickiest readers I've ever known. Most of the books that I recommend her, she is not interested in, like The House on the Cerulean Sea. She refuses to read, but this one I actually got her to read and she was so obsessed with it. She loved it, and she is so picky, and I feel like anybody else would really enjoy this. And I feel like I've talked about it quite a lot, but I don't hear anybody else talking about it. So I'm here to personally recommend this to you no matter what your book taste is. I think you should read this. Okay, we are at my #1 favorite book of 2024. And if you've been watching me for a while, I'm sure this will come as absolutely no surprise, because ever since reading this book, I have not shut up about it or the author, even though this is the only book I've read by him. Y'all are probably sick of hearing about this, but it is Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. I think this is probably the best book I've ever read. I am so obsessed with this. I think I will never get over it. It was just perfection. So this is about somebody who tries to rob a bank. It fails, and so they run into an apartment building next door where there's an open house going on, and they take everybody in the open house hostage. So there's like 9 or 10 people trapped in a small apartment unit. So we're following that whole situation, but we're also getting glimpses into the lives of the bank robber and all the hostages. Plus, at the same time, we have a father-son police duo who are trying to do the whole hostage negotiation thing, which they are very inexperienced at. So you see them kind of just like bumbling around. I feel like when some people hear the plot, they think it's a thriller because of the whole hostage thing, but it's really not. Our bank robber really has no idea what they're doing. And something I loved on the back of the book that really drew me in is this. But as the minutes tick by, they begin to suspect that the criminal mastermind holding them hostage might be more in need of rescuing than they are. But also, I totally owe my friend Mick everything for getting me to read this book, because she read it and absolutely loved it. And without her, I don't know when or if I ever would have picked this up. So thanks, Mick, because this is my favorite thing I've ever read. Like I said, I'm sure y'all are sick of hearing me talk about this, so let's move on. Now we're gonna do a total 180 because we're going from my absolute favorite book of the year to my least favorite books of the whole year. And these are not ranked or anything. I would say that they're probably all equally about my least favorite. And I'll preface by saying that I don't think any of these books are poorly written. Last year, I feel like I read some books that were just objectively poorly written, but I can say that I don't think any of these are. They just were either a bit of a disappointment for me. It all really boils down to personal preference, because I don't think any of these are really bad. I just didn't like them. Starting off with Gallant by V.E. Schwab. So she has made my top 5 and my least favorite. This is probably the only book on this list that I would say I didn't actively dislike. I just found it to be kind of boring, and honestly by the time I finished it, I felt like the whole book was kind of pointless. This is a young adult fantasy, and I don't really remember the plot very much. I just remember that I was never really that invested in the story, and I felt disappointed by the ending. I felt like everything we were building up to, I was kind of let down by at the end. I think the writing was fine. There were actually some quotes that I thought were really pretty, similar to Addie LaRue, but not anywhere near the same scale. So my issue really wasn't with the writing. I feel like it was more so with the plot. I just finished it and kind of felt like reading it was a waste of time. Like, it wasn't really worth it. The Then we have As Good as Dead by Holly Jackson, which if you saw the reading vlog in which I read this, you would know that I actually hated this book. This has to be my least favorite out of these 5 books. I really didn't like this one. And this is a lot of people's favorite book in the series. It's the last book in the Good Girl's Guide to Murder series, which is a young adult murder mystery series. To begin with, the series was never my absolute favorite, but I did enjoy it and I was looking forward to finishing it. And I feel like this was just the most ridiculous, out of pocket, unrealistic book that I've ever read. I really did not like the turn that this took. The first half of the book I was actually really enjoying. I was so invested and I feel like if we kept that up, this actually could have been my favorite in the series. But then in the middle of the book, we take a turn that I really did not enjoy. I felt it to be so unrealistic, so stupid, and just everything that happened after that point I was so not happy with. I was almost like hate reading the second half of it because I was like, this just keeps getting worse and worse. I had so many issues with this book, so if you want to hear them, you can go and watch that vlog, but I'm not going to hash them out right here. I just obviously really did not enjoy this. But it seems like a lot of people who love the series actually really enjoyed the ending, so if you liked it, then of course I'm happy for you. I really didn't. Then we have Misery by Stephen King, which I recently DNF'd. This was such a disappointment for me because I had been hyping it up in my head all year. I really wanted to get into more Stephen King and try out his horror books, and this was the one I was really excited for, and I just did not enjoy it. I think I only got like 40% of the way through, so obviously take everything I say with a grain of salt because I didn't even get halfway through it. But I just think that maybe Stephen King's writing is not for me. He is a super descriptive writer, and I feel like that is what really killed it for me. I really don't need that much detail. He gives so much detail about literally everything. I know I already talked about this, but I actually listened to the audiobook because I read the first like 2 pages and I was like, okay, yeah, I can't do this. I have to listen to it, which already is a bad sign. But there was literally a scene in the audiobook where I think I spent 15 minutes listening to him pick a lock. And I think that his writing is good, but I just personally didn't find it entertaining enough to push through. Next, we have Scarred by Emily McIntyre, and this is a great example of it being 100% about my personal taste and preference, nothing to do with the book. This is part of the Never After series, which is a bunch of dark romances that are very, very loosely based off of the premise of Disney stories, where the villain is the one that ends up getting with the girl. I read the first one, which is Hooked, which is about Captain Hook and Wendy, and that one was quite a wild ride. I feel like it was so crazy, so much happening. There were definitely some moments that I was like, okay, this isn't my favorite thing, but it was so entertaining and wild that it was fun to get through. So I was very intrigued to continue. And this one's about the Lion King, but they're not lions, obviously. They're people, and it's in this medieval setting. So that should tell you how very loosely based these are on the stories. But I personally really did not enjoy the romance in this one. I think when it comes to dark romances, I am okay if the characters are morally gray, if they are doing some questionable things, but I still want them to overall treat each other nicely and respectfully, kind of. I feel so silly, but this one is just not my cup of tea. I personally did not enjoy the way that our main characters treated each other and the way that they spoke to each other. And again, this was not the book's fault. I feel like it was more me, that I just learned about my personal preferences more. But my reading experience was not great, so I would definitely put this in my least favorite books. But again, I don't want to put the book down. I feel like if you like dark romances, so many people love the Never After series, so I would recommend it. Oh wait, okay, I have 5 books in front of me, but I forgot about one that I read on my Kindle. So actually I have 6 of my least favorite books to talk about. Before I forget, let's do the Kindle one, which was The Risk by S.T. Abbey, which is the first book in the Mindfuck series. This is actually another dark romance, but for totally different reasons, because we are following a serial killer and she is dating an FBI agent, which I feel like in terms of dark romances, that is much more my speed, and the dark romance of it all had nothing to do with why I hated this book. I had been looking forward to reading this series for so long. I've heard nothing but amazing things. Almost everybody I follow who has read it gives the series 5 stars. And I really love the premise of serial killer and FBI. I thought it was going to be so good, but I thought it was so bad. And I kind of take back what I said before. I kind of feel like this one is not very well written. That's the main issue that I have with this book, is I hated the writing and it felt very Wattpad to me. And not in a good way. I used to love Wattpad, and I feel like there's other books that I've read that felt Wattpad, but in a good way. This to me was very much in a bad way. And I actually read it during my 24-hour readathon with Mick and my roommate Kat, and all 3 of us had the exact same feeling. We all hated it. It was just so goofy, and I will say it's very short, so I understand that there's not a whole lot of room to grow within 100 pages, but it just did absolutely nothing for me. I did not enjoy the banter between the 2 main characters. I felt like there were so many things that were just totally unrealistic. For instance, he's an FBI investigator who is investigating her case, and he has her, this girl who he barely knows, over at his house, and he just has all of his case files like laid out around the house, pictures of murdered men and all sorts of stuff about the case just scattered around the house, and she is just going through it all. I think that at one point they're even discussing it together, Adler, and I was like, okay, this is totally not allowed. None of this would happen. You just met this girl. You're not going to be bringing her back into your apartment and going through your confidential FBI case with her. But just so many things like that. I thought it was so goofy, I feel like is the best way to describe it. And I was so disappointed because I've heard nothing but amazing things about it. So I had such high hopes. And I don't know, I just personally did not enjoy it, obviously. And I think there's a very slim chance of me ever continuing the series. Moving on to my last physical book, we have Nashs Ashes by Sarah Adler. And this is another DNF, so keep in mind I only got probably halfway through it before I quit. I read this one quite a while ago, so I don't remember exactly what happened. I do remember also feeling like things were unfolding in quite an unrealistic way, but I'm pretty sure my main thing was I think I really hated the main character, the male main character. I just remember thinking that he was so awful. I'm pretty sure that he was just mean. It would say all these things that were so rude and disrespectful, and then they would just get brushed under the rug. And I found him to be very insufferable, and I don't think I really enjoyed our FMC very much either. So I just could not push through this. I only got like halfway through before I ended up DNFing. And this was one that I hadn't heard much about, so it's not like I had very high expectations, but obviously anytime that I DNF a book, it's a disappointment. But I have heard good things about her other books, so maybe I'll give her other books a chance. But this one was sadly not it for me. Okay, so that was a lot of positivity, a lot of negativity. I obviously have quite a lot of feelings and opinions about all of these books. And again, if you enjoyed any of the books that are on my least favorite list, then I'm so happy for you. Just because I didn't like them doesn't mean that I want nobody else to like them. They just weren't for me. But that was really fun to look back at the year and see all the books that I really enjoyed and the ones that I didn't so much, and to share them with y'all. I hope I've convinced you to read at least one book on my favorites. If I did, let me know, or let me know any of the books that were your favorite or least favorite from this year. I feel like this is such a fun moment in time to just look back at the year and see how your reading went, and I cannot wait to watch everyone else's videos and get some more recommendations for 2025. But that's everything I've got. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in a couple days for another Bookmas video. Bye!